Welcome back to the David Pakman Show. I am Farron Cousins from Ring of Fire, sitting in for David Pakman today. Well, I've already talked earlier in the show about Republican strategy for the midterms, talking about the fact that one of the things they need to do is make sure that Democrats aren't able to deliver for the American public. But there's another thing that they're trying to do. Republicans across the country are trying to create these fake boogeymen to basically drum up their base and get them to be angry about something that doesn't even exist. Recently, writing for Business Insider, Manny Fidel put out a phenomenal article that I want to spend some time talking about because it's just so great. Title of it here is Republicans Are Winning Political Battles by Arguing Against Non-Existent Boogeymen. And one of the first examples he talks about is a recent tweet from Ben Shapiro, where Shapiro was whining about, the updated CDC guidelines recently. The vaccinated people need to wear masks. And Shapiro started going on a rant about, hell no, he's not going to wear a mask inside his own house, and his wife's not going to wear a mask inside their own house, and their kids aren't going to do that. And Republicans got all drummed up and said, oh, hell no, that's not happening. And then none of them bothered to think for a second that that's not happening. That's not an actual thing that the CDC said was going to happen. Didn't even come close to implying that. Nobody has ever said when you're in your own home, you have to wear a mask. But that didn't stop Shapiro from implying that, and then, of course, getting all of his little lemmings to go along with it and to become outraged by it. And that is just a tiny, tiny sliver of what Republicans are doing. They're trying to strawman their way to a victory in the midterms. And as Fidel points out, it's because they can't run on actual issues. Now, this is something I have been talking about for years, and this is the point I love to make. The Republican Party has not had a new idea in 40 years. The last new idea they had, this groundbreaking new thing they came out with and said, hey, look, here's a thing we've created, was trickle-down economics. And I'm sure we all know how well that worked out for everybody. But again, to their credit, it was a new idea. Just because it was a horrible idea, an economically devastating idea, it doesn't mean it wasn't new. But that was the last time that party collectively put their heads together and said, what can we do? And ever since then, it's been a rehash of the same dang thing every time they get in power. Trickle down, trickle down, trickle down. Hasn't been a Republican president in my lifetime that hasn't overseen some kind of recession, at least one recession, and a lot of it is tied to the trickle-down economics. And then, of course, Democratic presidents have to come and try to clean up the mess. We've never rebuilt the economy from when Reagan came out and destroyed unions and enacted trickle-down for 8 years. Yeah, it's been horrendous ever since then. The middle class has all but disappeared here in the United States. And even when we do have the recoveries, like what we're in now, we're not creating good-paying jobs. But look at me here, folks. I am getting off on a tangent. That's a story for another day, and maybe we'll talk about it. I've got some more fill-ins coming next week. But anyway, here's the thing. Back to the straw man issue. Shapiro's not the only one doing it. We have Republican governors all across the country passing these massive voter suppression laws. And they're doing it, they say, to get rid of all the fraud in these elections. Oh, Democrats want everybody to have a right to vote, they tell us, even illegal immigrants. We've all heard that talking point, not just from the 2020 election. We've been hearing that talking point from Republicans for well over a decade or two. Democrats want to give illegal immigrants the right to vote. Nope. Nobody ever suggested that, ever. Ever. But they use it. And the little Republican lemmings go out and they repeat those talking points. You see it on Facebook. You see it on Twitter. You see it constantly because there's no critical thinking. They get told a thing that is a blatant lie, and then they go out and repeat it so others get outraged by it. Another great example of legislating where it's not even necessary, transgender athlete bans. Right? State of Florida signed one of those. Oh no, if you were born a male, you cannot compete even if you identify as a female now. You cannot compete in women's sports. That wasn't a problem we were having here in the state of Florida. In fact, even if it were a thing that were happening, it still wouldn't even be an actual problem. But our governor, in between not letting us protect our kids from COVID, has been working on all of these horribly oppressive laws to address problems that don't actually exist here in the United States. There is no epidemic of people who were born men and later identify as women encroaching on women's sports and just dominating everybody. That's not happening enough to even warrant legislation, especially because this legislation is clearly biased, because it also says, but if you're a woman, if you're born a woman and then you identify as a man later in life, you can still play. You can play men's sports. We're totally cool with that. So yeah, weird, doesn't address a real actual problem, but the talking points that led up to that did get Republicans in a frenzy. They got everybody thinking, oh my God, we've got this horrific thing. All the men are in women's sports, the women are in men's sports. Who knows what's what? I'm scared and confused. And that's why we end up with this legislation, because they can't actually talk about the real issues. We've seen it with the Tea Party, as Manny Fidel also points out in his piece. Tea Party was basically funded by billionaires from the start, convincing people that Obamacare was going to be communism, or that you were going to be taxed to hell and back in order to pay for this. Two things, by the way, that never actually happened. But they got people to think these things were true, and they went out there and did the billionaires' bidding. It's the same thing when you see somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene refer to Democrats as communists. They're not communists. But you say it enough, the lemmings believe it. The lemmings get mad about that. The lemmings start to yell, we're not going to have communists in our dang country. No siree, Bob. And they do all of this. In fact, the entire culture war exists because Republicans are so terrible on real issues. They can't talk about the economy. As I mentioned, every Republican president in my lifetime has overseen at least one recession during their tenure. They suck at the economy. Well, they can't really talk about middle class because their trickle-down economics have destroyed the middle class. They can't really gripe about wages and what to do about that because they're the ones kind of holding up the whole increasing the minimum wage thing. They can't talk about health care because, well, they don't want anything to change and the current system's killing people. They don't want to do anything that's actually going to benefit real American citizens. They only care about their wealthy donors. You know, repealing environmental standards, increasing the amount of mercury in the air and water, that doesn't benefit us. That actually hurts us, folks. But they still push this as some kind of freedom from tyranny. A tyranny that doesn't exist. Most of these Republican boogeymen don't actually exist. But they would rather fight against these phony enemies because it's really hard, by the way, to disprove a negative. So when Republicans go out there and they just make stuff up to be mad about, like, oh my God, Joe Biden wants to muzzle all your dogs out there. How dare he? We can go out there and we can say, wait, no, he doesn't. But they're going to say, but yes, he does. Show me the evidence where he doesn't. There's no evidence that he doesn't because he didn't do the thing. So you see what I mean? Like, it is very hard to disprove a negative. And that's how Republicans win on these issues, unfortunately. They get people worked up with lies and misinformation and stupid talk, to be frank with you. And then we always end up having to be on the defensive trying to correct the record. And unfortunately, that's an uphill battle because by the time we've finally figured out a way to address the nonsense, Republicans have already told 10 more lies before we could even finish debunking the first one.